Hey, what's going on, guys? It is Paul from Guitar Gear Connection, and welcome to the second video in a series of videos going over what strings the Beatles were possibly using on their guitars. In this video, we're going to be covering both George's dial-up mute and flip-up mute Gretsch Country Gentlemans, along with his Gretsch Tennessean. So let's get right into it. Factory Gretsch strings were truly unique. As someone fascinated by vintage strings and having examined numerous brands, I've yet to come across another manufacturer that incorporated a large puff-of-like fur material at the ball end of the string. It's equally rare to see any kind of wrapping on a round wound string. This technique was typically reserved for flat wounds to help secure the flat tape wrap. Comparing them side by side with a standard round wound and flat wound string from the 1960s, it's clear that Gretsch set themselves apart with this distinctive style. And this style is how I first discovered George Harrison using factory strings on his 1963 Gretsch Tennessean. During the Beatles' performance at Shea Stadium on August 15th, 1965, George's 6119 clearly displays yellow puffs of fur on the back half of the Bigsby's axle. This indicated that George was using Chet Atkins number 672 strings. Introduced in 1955, Chet Atkins number 672s were the factory strings on all Chet Atkins signature model guitars. These strings were an 11 through 52 round wound set featuring a wound G. I was fortunate to acquire a set from the early 60s and another from the late 60s, both of which measured the same gauging. Additionally, I managed to collect a few incomplete mix-match sets that included yellow puff Chet Atkins strings. These two maintained the same gauging. Chet Atkins number 672 strings featured a round core wire wrapped in a number 400 alloy, commonly known as Monel. Monel is primarily composed of nickel and copper, along with a few other elements. Number 672s remained Monel until 1968, shortly after Gretsch was acquired by Baldwin, when they transitioned to pure nickel. However, it's worth mentioning that some references suggest that the strings were actually a nickel-plated steel during this period. 672s were crafted to deliver that bright, crisp country twang that George Harrison sought after during the Beatles' early years. Gretsch string sets also included an extra high E and B string, a noteworthy feature that we'll be discussing further. After discovering the Shea Stadium photo, I became curious if any other photos from a similar angle might also capture that distinct yellow puff. The next example I find was just a few months earlier during the performance in Milan. In this image, it appears George was using number 672s in the B and G positions. The high E string seems to have an orange threaded wrap, possibly a factory Rickenbacker string, as I discussed in my recent 12-string video. Meanwhile, the D, A, and low E strings appear to be a plain round wound without any kind of wraps or puff of fur. This photo also offers insight into how George dealt with a broken string. It appears he would only just replace that individual one that broke with whatever extra singles they had available. We can even see George using Chet Atkins strings as backups on his 1963 Rickenbacker 360. Since the 1965 tour marked the height of Beatlemania, at least in my eyes, it makes sense that George would put on a new set of strings at the start of that tour. However, this raises the question, if Milan was only the third show out of their 8-stop European tour, why didn't he start the tour with a new set? While preparing to publish this video, I found a photo from the Beatles' first stop on the European tour in Paris, dated June 20th, 1965. It appears George did indeed have a new set of strings on at the beginning of that tour. However, it's puzzling that by their Milan performance, he would possibly have broken a low E, A, and D string. It could be that the yellow puffs are present, just not visible. However, the broken high E string is definitely understandable. Initially, I had assumed that when the Beatles got to America for the start of the 1965 US tour and obtained the Manny's rental J160E, they also, well, likely through Mal Evans, grabbed extra sets of factory Gretsch strings. But seeing George with the yellow puffs present at the start and end of the European tour, It makes me wonder how hard these strings really were to get outside of America. London Sound City served as a Gretsch distributor in the early 1960s. While there's no direct evidence, it's likely they stocked factory Gretsch strings. Sound City is where George purchased his flip-up mute Country Gentleman, making it a probable location for picking up extra sets. As I examined more photos, additional evidence emerged of George Harrison's Tennessean being strung with Chet Atkins number 672 strings. With factory strings evident at different stages on the Tennessean, and seeing the Country Gentleman came factory with 672s as well, I set out to find signs of that distinct yellow puff on both his flip-up mute and dial-up mute Country Gentleman. After a bit of searching, I stumbled upon this fantastic photo showing the back half of the flip-up mute Country Gentleman's axle with the yellow puff of fur present. Next, I focused on the dial-up mute Country Gentleman. Sure enough, I found another excellent image clearly displaying the unique features of the number 672 strings. There are a few possibilities on why George decided to stay with factory strings. For one, he wasn't really a guitar-savvy guy, especially during the early Beatle days. Most guitarists know that switching string types can alter tension and intonation, making the guitar less desirable to play and requiring a setup. By using factory strings, George probably avoided many of these issues. However, with the Beatles constantly traveling and encountering different climates, he likely became accustomed to shifts in his action. Additionally, Mal Evans, who managed their gear, was usually tasked with sourcing supplies for the band. Being largely unfamiliar with the guitars, Mal likely defaulted to asking for whatever strings were factory standard for their instruments. Though I won't go into too much detail to avoid spoiling future videos, it's apparent that Mal often purchased strings in bulk, or in some instances, was provided with large quantities of certain strings. This practical approach also ensured that the boys consistently had strings at all times. Next, let's talk about the extra high E and B string included in these sets. On average, most packs back in the day would come with a wound G string. Players would switch the wound G in favor for an unwound G, allowing them to bend much easier. According to the gearbook, the most common method involved using an extra high E string in the B position and shifting all the strings up. If an extra high E string was not available, guitarists would use an equivalent banjo string. This technique eventually inspired one of Fender's most iconic string sets, Rock and Roll number 150s. Without going far off topic, it was actually V.C. Squier that produced the first light gauge string set for Rickenbacker back in 1953, number 410s. V.C. Squier would then be bought out by Fender in 1965, thus the introduction of rock and roll strings in 1966. Okay, back on track. Another common method players would use back in the day was to replace the G string with an extra B string or a similar gauge banjo string. Here are two possible setups George might have used as a substitute for the wound G. Again, I believe George made use of the extra strings included in the Gretsch packs one way or another. So what strings should I get to replicate the original Gretsch 672s as close as possible? Personally, Kurt Mannigan Manel's seem to come very close. However, at the end of the day, any string you put on your Gretsch guitar will sound great, as long as you stay within the original gauging and material. Though I haven't personally tried it myself, experimenting with the possible string combinations George may have used as a replacement for the wound G could be the key to unlocking some of that iconic George Harrison tone. So what strings do you use on your Gretsch guitars? Comment below, let me know. Thanks for watching everybody, catch you on the next episode.